Hello and welcome to the challenges of designing, executing, and evaluating a purpose-led ESG strategy. Very happy you're here for this session. We've got a very strong panel with us. Let me introduce them. We have Jacques Ripoll, the CEO of Crédit Agricole CIB, and also the Deputy General Manager of Crédit Agricole France. We also have Karen Wong, Global Head of ESG and Sustainable Investing at State Street Global Advisors. Welcome to the panel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, ESG, environmental, social, governance factors have become increasingly important for businesses, for investors, obviously for consumers as well. They're looking to what businesses are doing at that front. But maybe we need to begin this discussion before we get into the detail of strategies, whether executing or designing them, to understand right now in the early 2022, after the pandemic, after everything we've been through, sort of what does ESG mean? Why is it important? Perhaps I can start with you, Jacques, to give your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mustafa. I think that maybe my first remark would be to say that in a way which is a bit surprising, and I don't know if the correlation is a very obvious one, but we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic a huge increase of the importance of ESG for our clients, for our staff, especially when it goes to all that goes around the E, the climate change, the environmental issues. I don't have a clear explanation. Is it maybe because people suddenly feel with the pandemic that it can be something that completely escapes to the control of the governments, the society, that suddenly hits us, and they make a parallel with climate change? But what is crystal clear is that we've seen a huge increase. I think, and we'll discuss that more in details, that this has translated at the client level, both on the retail side, but that's not the area that I'm in charge of, but more on the corporate investment banking side. We've seen everyone shifting into a decarbonized energy-based, renewable energy-based society, and that has a huge change. And on the governance side also, I'll be interested in having the views also of Karen. We've seen that more and more. This is a topic that is becoming of the utmost importance for our stakeholders.
Thank you for that, Jacques. Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly echo what Jacques just said about the tremendous increased interest in ESG investing. And as one of the world's largest asset managers, we take fiduciary duty very, very seriously. And many studies have found that consideration of material ESG factors can enhance long-term value, right? So what I think the pandemic has done really in this context is it has shed a spotlight on ESG and performance, right? So, because what we have observed, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, that companies with stronger ESG practices tend to perform better because they're more resilient, and especially during times of market distress, right? So I think that might be a possible explanation as to why companies are taking ESG a whole lot more seriously than before the pandemic. One other thing I think it's important to keep in mind too is that there's a lot of short-termism in the marketplace, right? We focus on quarterly earnings, for example, and that really hinders companies' ability to create long-term value. Again, that's our main focus as a fiduciary. And ESG enables company to refocus, because many ESG factors and issues, as Jacques mentioned, climate change, these are very long-term issues. So companies are now thinking a lot more on the long-term issues than just focusing solely on financial return.
That's really interesting because as you said, there's a lot of focus on short-termism, but investors obviously want returns, but maybe there's an understanding now that returns have to be sustainable, and that requires extra accountability, extra transparency, being more measured in terms of how a business is run. And ESG, which has evolved out of many things, including CSR, offers a framework. But I wonder, Jacques, if I go back to you, how often or how more frequent actually has ESG, been part of discussions for you day to day, and has that very much increased recently? Have you noticed?
Well, it's been a topic which has been at the very heart of the Crédit Agricole group for ages. And I guess that everybody will tell you that, but in our case, we have a few specific angles, and that resonates to what Karen was saying. I think that, as Karen was saying, you have to be able to do ESG because it's for the good, but also it has to translate for all the stakeholders, including the shareholders, into performance. Or in the case of an asset manager, because of its fiduciary duty, it has to translate also in performance of the funds. And so we always have to keep in mind this angle. In our case, the beauty of it is that our shareholders are 57% are mutual banks. And those mutual banks, they have a vision of the return on their investment and the profitability of the bank, which is somehow a bit different because they are not owned by capitalistic hands, but they're a mutual bank. So it enables us to have ESG completely embedded since years in our DNA. What does that mean? That means that, for example, when it goes to climate change, we've been the leader, we've been the number one in green bond issuance for 10 years. Because 10 years ago, when it was not very glamorous or trendy, our shareholders were telling us it's not just about performance, it's also about our responsibility in the society. And that's why, we've been developing this angle for so long. That's our angle. I guess that for Karen, it's a different angle, which is the fiduciary duty. For others, it'll be something else. But you have at one stage to reconciliate the importance of ESG with all your stakeholders, including the shareholder. I don't know what you think, Karen.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the one thing I would add to it is it really would have to start from the board, right? Because that's very important. The board sets the strategic direction of the company, and having an effective, independent, diverse board, it's the very beginning. And then from there, it really would have to percolate deeply and widely across the organization, right? Senior leadership commitment, all the way down to middle level, working level employees, and even beyond the organization, right? Engagement with suppliers, engagement with stakeholders. And then also, I think, going back to the, how do we see it day to day? And I think it's important for us to have beyond governance and strategy, to develop targets and metrics, right? So that people can actually keep clear KPIs and monitor progress. Those are very critical success factors.
Well, it seems like it's a large-scale undertaking to bring ESG into any business, from what I'm hearing from both of you. So if you've touched upon a couple of benefits, one being obviously that it sends a good message, but then the other that, for example, you got into bonds early, and now that's a faster growing area in which you're preeminent in. But I mean, apart from those, are there other tangibles, perhaps, Karen, you can point to that help you encourage all stakeholders related to the business to take on more responsibility for ESG strategies?
Yeah, perhaps what I would provide here is an example on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So for, excuse me, for many years, we've seen research suggesting that we can drive return, right? Again, the motivation is important. Understanding why we do it is important. And so our first step in our work toward promoting diversity is the Fearless Girl campaign that started in 2017. And we're able to actually, through our stewardship program, we're able to see significant increase in number of female board members to company boards. So that's the beginning. That was the beginning. And then in 2022, we actually expanded it in light of the protest against racial injustice. And so what we ended up doing across State Street is we created a 10 action plan across the organization to address racism and inequality and to promote racial equity. Now, if you look at the 10 action plans, I'm not going to go over, item by item, but just to highlight a few, right? Number 7 of the plan is to partner with our asset stewardship team and the Ford Foundation and Russell Reynolds to study on what the board can bring to oversight of racial and ethnic diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we actually published a report last summer to that effect, and there are recommendations that came out of that study for different boards to focus on promoting diversity, starting from recruitment of board members to creating business strategy and culture and clear and quantifiable KPIs. So those are the things that we focus on. There are the 2 very important points here. One is make it public. So transparency is critical. And second is provide the progress, right? So that it's transparent to the key stakeholders, but it's also holding ourselves accountable by providing progress to the public.
Yeah, and I guess that we have the same kind of approach. Some come from the companies, some come from the laws in France, for example. You cannot have a board without having 40% of women in your board. It's just one angle of diversity, the gender one, and it's been in place for a couple of years. And there's no way if you don't do that, the decisions of the board are just not valid. Same thing within the company. What we have put in place is a fair process for every promotion above a certain level. And a fair process means that there is a long list, then a short list, and then we interview the people. And in this short list, we include some diversity criteria. So we need to have a certain number of people representing that diversity in the shortlist. Otherwise, we cannot promote someone. And it's very surprising because it has a very direct impact on who we promote, which is scary in a way. As soon as you force people into looking wider than that they would have envisaged at the beginning, suddenly they discover talent outside the usual framework of what they were looking for.
I mean, I think we understand that diversity helps build resilience, helps give you agility. But you mentioned key stakeholders, Karen, and I mean, which groups are the most important for delivering on an ESG strategy?
Well, I don't think there's any one particular most important, right? We engage with many stakeholders, from our clients, obviously, to our regulators, right? And those that set rules and guidelines for us to operate. So we engage with them. We engage with our suppliers. And internal engagement is also very critical, right? First, make sure people understand the motivation. Second, as Jacques mentioned, people have to practice. So it's not owned by any one particular department or me as the head of ESG for State Street Global Advisors. One thing I try every day is to make sure people know that I'm not the only one owning the ESG conversation. Everyone should own it, right? The hiring decision, to Jacques' point, the promotion decision, people would have to first understand why we do it and how I can enable them to do it, right? Providing resources and so forth. So I think all together, with all the stakeholders involved, I think over the long run, we'll get there. But I do think that one point I would want to make here is that there will be setback and people would have to understand that too, right? And I think that's very real. If you look at our work toward promoting diversity in our own workforce, we're facing challenge, quite honestly, in the last 2 years during the pandemic, because look, women are just more vulnerable right? Because they are more likely to stay home to take care of families, sick family members, and so forth. So we're not making as much progress as we would like, but we know it's a short-term setback. So I think it's important for us to recognize that. It may go sideways at some point.
And if I can add something to what Karen was saying, to which I 100% agree on, I think that it's a personal duty and personal responsibility of the top management of the companies. You know, if you take all the issues around whether diversity, governance, or environment, you know, I happen to have 5 kids, and trust me, they put pressure on me to a point that no board can put pressure on me. You know, if I don't want to sleep in the bathroom, you know, I'd better be a good banker with regards to those issues. And so, joke apart, I feel that me being the CEO of a big bank, I don't want to be in 20 years with people telling me, okay, what have you done? And be in a situation where I can just say, you know what, I've just issued green bonds. I have a personal duty there. What have you done for diversity? Have you been acting with a governance which was a sane one? If I feel that it's my personal duty as Jacques Ripoll, then I will implement it in the most efficient way. If it's something which is plugged upon us and in which we have to obey because there's a couple of rules, then, you know, I don't think that we will take the 100% benefit of this approach.
That's a very good point, Jacques. I would certainly echo that, because ownership from the top is critical, but then we also own it on ourselves to make sure people understand why they should do it, right? The motivation is very critical. The organizational learning is very critical. And it's certainly not easy, but I think understanding the why would be a huge step forward.
It's interesting because, I mean, you mentioned your children, but I mean, it's a very valid point, Jacques, because what is the best approach when it comes to implementing, you know, environmental, social, and governance factors? Is it about listening to everything outside, whether it's French law or your family or your customers, or is it about listening to people inside the business, or also a business's history as well? I mean, there's a track record, you know, not all history is bad, despite what people, you know, tend to make a noise about these days. Culture is important. It's a reason why businesses are successful. So how do you strike a balance between the external and the internal to be able to properly craft a successful strategy when it comes to ESG?
Well, if I can try to do the first answer, I think that it would be an issue if there was a big difference between the internal and the external approach. But in reality, we see exactly the same trend. You know, my clients are more and more diverse in terms of the CEOs, the CFOs, the treasurer. My clients are more and more concerned by a good governance. They're more and more engaged into a transformation of their industrial setup. So it resonates a lot to them. And if I was having a different approach, I would be in complete contradiction, not only internally when I recruit, but also when I speak to my clients. So I'm happy to say that, and I guess, Karen, you see the same thing. There's no disconnect between the internal and the external. We're part of the same society.
Yeah, I certainly would echo that 100%. I think the days of having to convince people why they should do it, that's not the majority of the conversations anymore, right? It's really more about the how. How do I do it? What can I do to achieve the long-term value creation, but also at the same time not doing not causing any adverse impact.
And it is about impact. And you know, it's not ESG for the sake of ESG, but the point is to actually achieve something that is in line with business goals, I assume. Is that right, Jacques?
Absolutely.
It's business goal, and it's also the society in which we live. You know, there is a company in France which says there is no winning company in a society that loses. And I think it's true.
Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, no, and I think there are many externalities that we have to focus on, right? And one thing that we have a more laser focus on is materiality, right? Because you really cannot address every single issue available in front of us at every moment. So materiality is something that would help us anchor our focus. But
Well,
yeah, absolutely important to consider those externalities in investment and business decision making.
Yeah, 100% agree on that. Externality is the main thing. And to be honest, I think we're a bit poor. It's getting better in some areas, but if you look at biodiversity, for example, it's still very, I mean, the amount of KPIs we have on that one is very limited. And I agree with Karen. You cannot escape that.
so there's real momentum on the ESG side, but still some way to go, I think is the assessment. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jacques, for being with us. And thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thanks, Mustafa.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.